welcome to this seminar on human rights in a new Putin era. We have today a very distinguished panel to discuss this topic. To my right here, Svetlana Reiter. Svetlana is a Moscow-based journalist. She is correspondent for the Moscow cultural magazine Большой город, which means a big city, and she is also a special correspondent for Esquire Russia. Now, Svetlana specializes in social themes, and considering the sort of social escalation that we've seen in Russia for the last 6 months, her articles have gained a lot of attention in Russia, both in the legacy media and in the blogosphere. One of her most well-known articles was the interview she did in 2011 with the head of the Russian Committee for Torture, Igor Kalyapin. The article was published under the name Caucasian Greyhounds, and a few months after the publication of the article, Svetlana was interrogated by the FSB in relation to this article. Next to Svetlana, we have Katya Sokirianskaya. Katya is really one of the leading experts on Northern Caucasus. She worked for many years for Memorial, which is one of the major Russian NGOs dealing with human rights. During these 9 years, she was stationed 5 years in the Northern Caucasus. She is now project director at the International Crisis Group, based in Moscow. And then we have Stig Fredrikson. Stig has a long and impressive career as a journalist. He's worked among many media organizations with Actuel, Ecoredaktionen, Associated Press, and he was foreign correspondent in Moscow during the 70s. He was then posted as a foreign correspondent in Washington, and in the last 20 years he's been actually one of the principal foreign policy analysts for Swedish television with a focus on Russia. So back to our seminar. Now, why this title? Human rights in a new Putin era. I mean, after all, Putin has had the real power for more than 12 years. Still, the extraordinary events with the demonstrations we saw in the major big cities in Russia before, during, and after the last both parliamentary and presidential elections, the intensive use that the opposition made of the web, using it as a platform for their political ideas or programs. I mean, all this gave the impression that maybe Russia was heading for a more democratic path. However, what we have seen in the last 6 months is actually a number of repressive actions against the opposition and a series of really oppressive legal measures. And what am I referring to here? I'm referring to, first, the new law which expands the definition of treason to consulting or other types of work for a foreign state or foreign organization or international organization. What does this mean? It means that actually the wording of this new law is so loose that anyone whom the authorities wishes to punish could actually fall under that legislation. Secondly, I'm referring to the new legislation on NGOs. NGOs receiving funding from abroad who now have to register as foreign agents. Thirdly, I'm referring actually to the recriminalization of defamation in Russia. And fourth, I'm referring to the new legislation on tightening the control over internet for offensive material concerning children. Now here again, the wording of the law is such that actually the authorities could close entire websites if you have only one page with exclusive material among thousands of other pages. We do not contain that kind of material. So we have now we have since the last 6 months, a new legal framework, and added to that, we have a series of oppressive measures, or actions against the opposition. We've seen the sentence for the Pussy Riot, 2 years of jail for the Pussy Riot girls. We've seen a series of widespread arrests of leading opposition members, court cases being brought up against them. We've seen their homes being searched. We have seen also the eviction from the parliament of one of its members, Gennady Gudkov. Gennady Gudkov actually very openly called for Putin to give back some of his power, and this eviction has been very well orchestrated by the Kremlin. We've seen the arrest of an opposition member in Kiev, and we've seen also the more and more threatening situation for both journalists and human rights defenders in Russia in general, and even more in the North Caucasus. And all this happening in actually an environment of total impunity, and in an environment where you have the judiciary working hand in hand with the authorities. So this is sort of the background to this today's seminar. And now I will give the floor to our three panelists, starting with Stig. Stig will give us a sort of a general view of Putin and civil society. Then Svetlana will actually focus on freedom of expression, what the new legislation means for journalists in Russia today, what kind of impact it has on their work, the issue of court cases against journalists and the problem of censorship. And then Katya will actually give us a broad overview of the situation in the Northern Caucasus. So Stig, the floor is yours. And each of you have 15 minutes.
Well, thank you, Benedicte, for this introduction, and thank you for the invitation to come here today. I've been asked to, as Benedicte said, try to analyze Vladimir Putin's attitude towards the civil society and the conditions for human rights in the new Putin era. Actually, this is my personal analysis that you will hear, it's easy because to me the new Putin is the old Putin. It's really very easy. There is no change. Today it's more or less 6 months since he was installed for his third mandate period as president. But it's the old Putin. I think that in order to understand Vladimir Putin's position and attitude towards Russia's civil society, I think the starting point should be this. Vladimir Putin is a control freak. Vladimir Putin is a control freak. His authoritarian rule is based on the principle that his government should control every important aspect of Russia's political, economic, and social life. Putin's so-called power vertical means that the Kremlin wants to control the nation by decision-making from the top and down through all of society. As I understand Putin's thinking, all the things that he cannot control are a threat, a menace to his rule and to the system known as Putinism. And therefore, Putin is especially angered by many of the elements that we normally associate with a civil society. Independent media, independent NGOs, they are perceived by Putin as a threat to his rule because he cannot control them. And the same, of course, goes for all kinds of political opposition, competing political parties not controlled by the Kremlin. They are also a threat and therefore cannot be tolerated. Let me go back a little bit in the recent history. I know that the more or less accepted image in Russia today of the 1990s is that this was a decade of steadily growing chaos and anarchy in society. The oligarchs ruled Russia, both politically and economically. The Russian Federation was about to collapse because republics, and not only Chechnya, wanted their independence, and most ordinary Russians just became poorer and poorer. Putin inherited from Yeltsin a Russia that was down on its knees, and he promised to do something about it. He promised the Russians order and stability in society, and gradually also a better life. He established a social contract with the nation, and it went like this. Let me and my men rule Russia the way we understand it. Let us take care of all the important decisions in the country, while you, the people, you can take care of your personal life, your private life, your family, your pursuit of personal happiness. If you don't engage in politics and leave that to me, I promise you a steady rise in your standard of living. I'll give you sausage in exchange for your freedom. I can agree with a lot of the criticism against what happened in the 1990s. But to me, the 1990s was also a decade when the civil society began to emerge in Russia as a continuation of the freedoms that the Russians got during the glasnost years, during the second half of the 80s. To me, the 90s was a decade when many Russians, and not least a younger generation, started engaging themselves in society, in forming a freer and more democratic society, maybe for the first time in Russia ever. These people wanted Russia to become a normal, civilized society, and they became active in political parties, in human rights groups, in environment and energy issues, saving nature, just to mention a few. Putin put an end to most of all these freedoms during his first 8 years as a president. And his basic argument was that he perceived everything that he could not control as a threat to his own rule. And now that Putin is back as president, he will just continue on the same road. He will try to keep a lid on all civil liberties in Russia. He will meet the demand for reforms with a clenched fist, not with an open hand. As Benedicte said, towards the end of last year, something happened in Russia, as we all know. Thousands of people, most of them middle class, broke the social contract with Putin. The rigged Duma elections were the factor that triggered people to demonstrate in the streets again for the first time in 2 decades. But to me, maybe the cheating at the polls was not the worst thing. I think that many Russians got really offended and humiliated already in September last year, when Putin and Medvedev announced that they planned to swap jobs between themselves, and that they had decided this already in 2007. That was, I think, the ultimate offense to so many Russians. That was how little their leaders cared about their opinion and their vote. But really, we should not be surprised. Putin is convinced that his authoritarian rule is the best model for Russia. And that is a model where the state and the government control everything what happens in society. And now, as president again, Putin is interested in maintaining the status quo, the stability that he claims that he has created. Of course, we must also understand that he is anxious for himself. He is determined to hold on to the power and the money that he and his closest associates have gathered for themselves during more than a decade now. In Putin's Russia, the old oligarchs have been replaced by state oligarchs. We must also remember that Putin is a man formed by his Soviet upbringing and his Soviet career. He has no democratic instincts. His instincts tell him that only a Russia with strong state institutions, especially the so-called siloviki institutions, can function as Putin wants the state to function. His mind is still the mind of a KGB lieutenant colonel. When the Soviet Union collapsed, the KGB was one of the few institutions that kept the nations intact, according to Putin's view. Once a KGB agent, always a KGB agent, is Putin's motto. As a leader, nostalgic for the order and stability during Soviet times, Putin hates all forces in society that he sees as destabilizing. He makes life more and more difficult for all the NGOs, and he is especially suspicious of those organizations that receive funding from abroad. He hates independent media because in his heart he thinks that all journalists can be bought and therefore controlled by the state. He is determined not to allow any really independent and competing political parties or opponents to his own rule. Therefore, Mikhail Khodorkovsky will remain in prison as long as Putin stays in power. He is also very suspicious of the intentions of the United States and NATO towards Russia, and is quick to blame the United States for meddling in Russian affairs when they try to support the civil society. The Putin foreign policy has become more and more anti-Western. Once again, Vladimir Putin is a control freak. He will continue to suppress and try to stop everything in society that he cannot control during his new term as president. For Putin, harder measures against opposition leaders, harder laws against NGOs, harder control over the internet is the only way of preserving the rule that he has built. But where Putin sees stability, more and more Russians see stagnation. The protests and the demonstrations, as I see it, signify an awakening of important segments of Russian society, particularly the middle class, after a long, long sleep. Once again, people start taking interest in civil society, and not only in their private lives. I think that a president, a leader, should welcome that people engage themselves in society, because that means contributing to a healthier and stronger society. But I'm afraid that this is not how Putin sees things. To him, the defenders of human rights are a threat that he must control and suppress. Thank you for your passion.
Can you hear me? Oh yeah, okay. Well, Stig, thank you very much for these really valuable insights, and now I give the floor to Svetlana.
Yeah, can I sit here?
Oh, you're welcome, absolutely.
And I don't have that much of a, organized speech or something like this. Despite what Benedicte told, I'm not a big specialist in North Caucasus. Basically, I was doing the articles on what they call their social problems. I was observing courts, I was writing about handicapped, and it it was some sort of coincidence that I made an interview with Igor Kalyakin, who is somewhere on the conference, but not in this place now. And the thing he told me really shocked me. It was the story about the guy called Islam Umar Pashayev, who kidnapped in Chechnya, and he was tortured, and he survived, but it cost him a lot of trouble to survive. And referring to what Sofia just told, she told that in some media she's reading the stories about боевики and about Eskadrony Smерти. What I'm trying to say, I think the main problem in Russia's media is not the new laws and not the repressions. Our problem is that we didn't write enough thing, let's say, about North Caucasus. We didn't focus enough on the problems of North Caucasus. I counted on my 2 fingers the amount of independent newspapers writing about problems of North Caucasus in Russia, and it's Novaya Gazeta. Irina Gordienko, great journalist, she's somewhere also here, maybe not. And Kommersant Olya Aronova, who's also writing a lot about it. That's about it. And we have a bunch of the other newspapers, society newspapers, social newspapers, and media and television and whatever. And if you go to your editor and tell him to write about North Caucasus, it will be either, well, maybe it will be too scary for the readers. I'm talking about some sort of a, like, glossy magazine, you know, just not glossy about fashion, but some regular magazine, you know, or it will be, maybe it will be so scary for us. So in this case, I think we're dealing with some sort of a self-censorship, because officially we still have freedom of speech in Russia, and we still don't have the censorship in Russia, officially. Officially we're free. But what I'm trying to explain, that sometimes journalists and editors are stopping themselves from writing about North Caucasus because they think that it's too difficult or too dangerous. And the reason we need to write about North Caucasus, because all the problems we can see in North Caucasus are so typical for Russia lately. The torture of the people, the kidnapping of the people, I don't know, the police massacre or whatever they call it, you know. And I think the problem of the media was that we didn't pay enough attention to it and we didn't point it. And that's why probably, maybe it sounds a bit populistic, but maybe that's why we have it now more and more in Russia. Because if we as citizens let it to happen in one place, then we letting it happen in the other places as well, because we're still the same country and we still support each other, I think. So to talk about journalism in Russia, it still looks sort of okay, but it's just from the first point of view, because as I told, we have one independent radio station, that's Echo Moskvy, and 2 sort of independent newspapers. We have few electronic medias, and they're still writing about it. But from the other side, we have state television, on which picture about Russia is completely absurdly different from what is going on in real life. So if you look at the television in Russia, or if you read any official state paper, like Российская Gazeta, you will have a complete different picture. It will be like, they call him white, they call him black, and black they call him white. And I think it's our fault as well as a journalist, because a few years ago, we let government to separate media and media. Now we have, I don't know, the objective media and subjective media, and I think it's our fault as well, because we are colleagues and we are journalists. And in the end of the day, we voted for this government and we voted for this president. So I think the media, and not only in 2 independent newspapers, they should be like all together, and they should be writing about what is really important, and they should be like, I don't know, because you didn't saw Russian television, it's a real nightmare, I mean the state television. So what I wanted to tell that sorry, I have my notes somewhere. Yeah, thing about oppositioner in Italian, Benedicte, the oppositioner who was in Kiev and now he's in Moscow. He was kidnapped, at his own words. He was kidnapped in Kiev, and then he was brought to Moscow, and we had a lot of meetings from the opposition, and we had a lot of protests because this guy told he was tortured and he was kidnapped. And the thing which really surprised me at this point, that my colleagues and me a bit, not a lot of my colleagues, probably two of my colleagues, they were writing about torture of people in Chechnya, torture of people in Dagestan, and torture of people in Ingushetia. I clearly remember marvelous article of Alexander Burtin in the magazine called Russian Reporter. He wrote about Zelimkhan Chitigov. He was tortured for 100 hours for 3 full days in, I believe it was in Ingushetia. And this thing, we should remember it all the time, that it's happening in our country, and we should write about it every day. I think that's very important. And I still seriously think we are not writing enough about it. And as for the other thing, I mean, still Russia is the most dangerous country for journalists. If you look at the statistic, in last 2-3 years, it was more than 200 journalists killed in Russia. And exactly 2 years ago, the colleague of mine named Oleg Kashin from Kommersant, he was beaten up to the pulp, and investigation on his case showed completely nothing. So they didn't find the guy who injured him. And if you look at the cases, it's almost 300 killing of the journalists, counting Natalia Stemirova, and they never found the guilty one. Only one case they found the guilty one, and so you have 299 cases of only one guilty found, and I think it's actually to my point of view terrible. And also I think it's also our fault, because we should write every day that not finding the guy, or I don't know, group of people who kidnapped and killed Estemirova. We should phone the investigator every day, every week. And I think we need to do more, and we need to remember the people who were killed, who were beaten up, and basically that's about it. Because I think as a media, we still have enough power to work in Russia, and if we want to write about something, we really need to write about it, and not to think if it will be dangerous for us, or if it will be, I don't know, boring or too scary for the readers. That's about it.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Journalists have any some sort of protection in Russia?
What I mean, like custody protection?
Like any protection?
The question asked was, do journalists in Russia have any form of protection?
And do the people, the right defenders sitting in this room are having any sort of protection? Do you? Well, basically no. I mean, the guy who was beaten 2 years ago, I mean, I don't think he is even having protection, you know, so.
So that could be one of the main reasons why a lot of journalists in Russia chooses not to write about
Choose self-censorship.
Yeah, but I mean, it's a compromise. I mean, they're not protected anywhere, and Russia is on the 3rd place, you know, still 2 more ahead. So, I mean, it's not the main intention when you need to write. I mean, when I'm saying we guilty, I mean I'm guilty as well, because I wrote just probably 2, 3, maybe 4 articles on North Caucasus, but and I'm mainly focusing now on the course about the opposition and all that stuff, and sometimes I am indeed forcing myself to write about something, and I'm not the main hero, really. I'm just okay. We have a lot of much better journalists in Russia than me, but what I'm trying to say that what we have in Russia is some sort of I don't know how to that's it's like few levels. You have few different. You have state media, you have this media, you have glossy media, you have social media. But we all, especially in this situation, when everything is really difficult, when they, you know, printing new and new laws which are shortening our freedom, we all need to stand together. That's basically my point of view. I mean, none of the journalists are having protection in the world. I believe that's the point.
Well, thank you, Svetlana, for this very interesting sort of insight to what it means being a journalist in Russia today. And now I will give the floor to Katya, who will give us this overview about the situation in Northern Caucasus.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Benedicte. Can you hear me?
Yes. Do you want to sit here, or do you want to stand over there?
Okay. On the 30th of September 1999, federal troops entered Chechnya and started what was officially referred to as counter-terrorist operation. In fact, this was the second war in Chechnya, which became the main issue which brought Vladimir Putin to presidency. Today, after 13 years of the so-called anti-terrorist operations, the conflict spread from Chechnya throughout the North Caucasus to the neighboring regions of Dagestan, Ingushetia, Kabardino-Balkaria, North Ossetia, Karacháyevo-Cherkessia, and even the overwhelmingly Russian-populated Stavropol Krai. Armed conflict in the North Caucasus today is the most deadly conflict in Europe. A day rarely goes by without an attack on Russian security official or a killing of alleged insurgent by law enforcement agencies. Militants commit almost daily attacks on security servicemen, sometimes carry out terrorist acts, occasionally as far afield as Moscow. Security services carry out counter-terrorist operations, gravely violating human rights. In 2011, more than 750 people were killed in the conflict as a result of clashes. Almost 600 killed during the first 9 months of 2012. These are just some of the results of the so-called counterinsurgency efforts since Putin took over the country. Security Services' human rights record in the North Caucasus has been egregious since the beginning of the Second War in Chechnya. The level of brutality in the Second War was generally much higher than in the first. Chechen militants at that time used terrorism, while security services applied massive force indiscriminately. The army, mostly unreformed technologically and methodologically, fought with weapons designed for large-scale conflict. Planes and artillery was used to eliminate small groups of combatants, which sometimes destroyed entire neighborhoods and settlements. Indiscriminate bombardments, especially of Grozny, caused a massive death of civilians. After the army established control over the Chechen territory, they started to apply what was called zachistkas, the mop-up operations. Human rights organizations reported numerous enforced disappearances and summary executions during these operations. 3,000 to 5,000 people disappeared only in Chechnya since 1999. Hundreds were found dead with unmistakable traces of torture. These are huge numbers in a population of less than 1 million that was in Chechnya at the time. As the conflict spilled over to other republics, the same methods based on abductions, incommunicado detentions, summary executions, falsifications of criminal cases were and are widely used there as well. The key word to the problem is impunity. Despite of the fact that thousands of cases have been very well documented by human rights organizations, just a handful of cases were actually investigated and people sentenced for the crimes they committed. So now the question is there a new Putin's era? Was Medvedev's rule any different? And if so, then how? And what should we expect in the future? If we look at the human rights situation, there was very, very slim difference between old Putin's era and Medvedev's era. During the Medvedev's time, security services committed grave human rights violations just as they did before, and were next to never held accountable. Independent media and human rights activists were systematically targeted, just as before, sometimes imprisoned and sometimes killed. The judicial system and the investigative authorities became even less professional, with a general tendency of degradation of the state and government institutions. Medvedev was the one who signed amendments to the Criminal Procedural Code, which banned jury trials for insurgency-related crimes. In the conditions when courts are very dependent, this deprived people suspected of insurgency-related crimes and terrorism their last hope of fair trials. So very often, cases which were falsified and evidence which was extracted under torture became the main proof of people's guilt when they were sent, and they were being sent to prison for long prison terms, virtually without any proof of their guilt. So human rights-wise, we can't really speak of any difference. At the same time, in the last few years, there was very slight liberalization of political regimes in the North Caucasus, apart from Chechnya. Chechnya has a very different story. Presidents Yevkurov in Ingushetia, Kanokov in Kabardino-Balkaria, Magomedov in Dagestan, and Timedov in Karachay-Cherkessia have been slightly more liberal and open than their predecessors. Moreover, there was a number of new methods that were used in the late years of Medvedev, related to more open religious policies, some elements of soft counter-terrorist measures and investment which was coming into the region. These developments led to certain changes on the ground, some of which were just a side effect of this slight liberalization. Others were a result of the newly introduced policies. Speaking of these new tendencies in the North Caucasus today, I would name three. First is ethnic revival. Second, the growth of moderate political Islamism, especially in Dagestan, and the launch of the Sufi Salafi dialogue. And third, the emergence of two competing counterinsurgency models. Well, speaking of ethnic revival, the peak of ethnic upsurge throughout Russia and in the North Caucasus occurred in the late 1980s and early 1990s. But even before, but since then, for over a decade, it seemed that the ethnic factor has fully died in the North Caucasus, and it was fully overridden by religion. However, since 2008 and increasingly now, we observe a new wave of ethnic awakening. The North Caucasus is the home of a host of ethnic and national groups, each of their very strong identities and cultures, ideas of historical homeland, grievances and aspirations. Most ethnic groups have some kind of territorial disputes and claims with their neighbors, which was a result of repeatedly and often arbitrarily redrawn borders, forced resettlements and deportations. Since 2008, national movements and national organizations have been resurrecting themselves and becoming increasingly visible actors in the political life of the North Caucasus. Ethnic groups such as Nogais, Kumiks, Lizgins, Avars, Laks in Dagestan, Circassians and Cossacks, and Ingush are sharpening their political demands and tend to focus on rehabilitation, justice, state support of native languages and culture, development, greater autonomy and access to land. Russia is an asymmetric federation in which comparable sized ethnic groups have qualitatively different statuses. Some nations, like for example Ingush, have their own administrative unit, they have a republic, while others, for instance Circassians, who are almost twice as numerous, they don't. An administrative unit guarantees greater representation in the local government, often control over police and better access to resources. So now many ethnic groups, without autonomy, again start demanding the change of the status quo. The second important tendency is today the growth of moderate Islamism, particularly in Dagestan, and the launch of Sufi Salafi dialogue. Islam is the majority religion in 5 out of 7 republics in the North Caucasus. And it has a very profound effect on political processes in the North Caucasus. For over 15 years, a very deep sectarian conflict divided the North Caucasus Muslims into traditional and fundamentalists. Traditional Islam was very closely linked to the ethnic traditions and is better integrated into the Russian social-political space. In Chechnya, Ingushetia, and Dagestan, the traditional Muslims are Sufis. But since mid-1990s until today, Islamic fundamentalism, mostly Salafism, has been becoming more and more prominent. The two movements clashed back in the 1990s. The state supported traditional Muslims, virtually banned Salafism, and committed and subjected them to systematic repressions throughout the region, which resulted in deep sectarian schism and radicalized the Salafi communities. But in 2011 and in earnest in 2012, real, authentic, bottom-up dialogue was launched between the traditional and Salafi Muslims, Sufi and Salafi Muslims, especially in Dagestan, in a republic where Wahhabism was officially banned since 1999. Regardless of bans, today, the Salafi community in Dagestan is the largest and the most vibrant. In April and June 2011 in Khachkar, the first civic dialogue meetings took place. They continued and erupted in the situation, in a dramatic security situation. And then in spring 2012, there was quite an important historical meeting in the central mosque of Khachkar, where the leaders of Sufi and Slavic communities, about 500 people, got together and decided to put an end to the conflict. They adopted a resolution, and they decided that from now on they will work together to overcome the sectarian schism. And they started routine daily work to bring together the fragmented and the conflicting communities. And the very tendency that we observe in the last couple of years of Medvedev's era was the introduction of the new, inconsistent, often insufficient, but still important approaches to counterinsurgency. Since 2010, the so-called commissions for adaptation of fighters were created. First in Dagestan and in other republics, which were tasked with assisting people who wanted to stop armed activity and get out of the forests to return to peaceful life. These commissions had virtually no additional legal mechanism to back their efforts, and their decisions were advisory. Their work was very often criticized, but they were very important because this was a new way of thinking about counterinsurgency. It was not counterinsurgency heavily based on massive indiscriminate force, but this was an attempt to create channels for people to peacefully come out. And this was very crucial in a situation when there is complete lack of trust between the population and the security services. There's basically lack of trust of the population in law enforcement agencies and in the state investigative institutions. So as I mentioned before, along with these commissions, there were more open religious policies introduced in Dagestan and in some other republics, in Ingushetia, in Karachay-Cherkessia, somewhat in North Ossetia as well. So as a result, by the end of Medvedev's rule, we had now two models of counterinsurgency implemented in the North Caucasus. One, very heavy-handed, based on indiscriminate violence against combatants and their alleged accomplices and their family members. And in addition, very close, very tough religious policy aimed at complete eradication of Salafism. And this is the model implemented in Chechnya. And a different model, more inclusive model, implemented in Dagestan, which seeks to combine law enforcement with new mechanisms to safe return of combatants to peaceful life, to greater religious freedoms and dialogue between Sufis and Salafis. And other republics somehow fell in between these two poles. So now let's see what happens with these three tendencies when Putin is back, or what can happen with them. Soon after the presidential elections, it became clear that these elements of the new methods of counterinsurgency have opposition, both in Moscow and in the region. The work of Dagestani and English commissions for adaptations of fighters became seriously challenged. And in spring, the president of Dagestan and his vice premier openly accused the law enforcement agencies of sabotaging the work of the commission. The Commission in Dagestan stopped convening for 5 months. It was denied access to preliminary detention facilities. There was a complete risk of this new mechanism being closed. The Commission in Ingushetia was threatened as well. The Commission in Kabardino-Balkaria and Karachay-Cherkessia, which were the last one created, didn't even start to function with Putin's arrival. In spring and in summer, some of the security operations showed that the federal security services and the regional authorities worked at cross purposes. When the regional authorities tried to let people peacefully surrender and return to peaceful life, the federal security services were more inclined to eliminate. The Sufi-Salafi dialogue is also very seriously threatened, and actually by both sides. Neither the insurgency nor the elements in the security services want them. Right after this important historical meeting in Makhachkala, the insurgency committed a managed terrorist act in Moscow, in Makhachkala, killing 13 and injuring 89 people. In August 2012, a suicide bomber killed the most prominent Sufi sheikh in Dagestan, Sayyid Afandi Cherkesky, in his home. For Dagestani Sufis, this is an unspeakable tragedy. The security services also retaliated with illegal measures. In the summer 2012, the respected Sufi leaders who participated in the dialogue were seriously threatened. One preacher was abducted and he's still missing. There was an attack on the life of the chair of the Salafi Association of Scholars. There was a number of mass arrests from the mosques. And just last week, a prominent leader of Salafis was killed together with his father and brother in South Dagestan. So the future of the dialogue is very uncertain. With the national movements, I expect that this trend will continue. Putin, political freedoms were significantly curbed at the federal level when Putin was the president in the first 2 terms. But he came back with a number of important political reforms. In 2012, there was an amendment to federal law on political parties, which now makes registration of small parties easier. And I expect that the national movements will have more opportunities within the small parties. At the same time, we're expecting a return of regional leaders. So now, of elections of regional leaders. So now the regional presidents will be elected again. And I think that this will also lead to ethnic mobilization, especially in the multi-ethnic republics. How will Putin react to the growth of the national movement is unclear. Already now, some of the activists were targeted all around the North Caucasus, and what we will see in the future is not known. Olympic Games is an important factor that we have to keep in mind. Putin takes it as his personal project. And it is also very important because clearly the Russian government will want to improve security by the time of games and keep the situation under control. On the 16th of October, Putin held a meeting with security services leadership, which is involved in counter-terrorist operations, and he said that the efforts of security services have to be more tough and preemptive and daring. Many fear that this means that we will have a return back to very, very tough measures. Some say that this might not happen exactly because Sochi ensures that there will be a greater international attention to the region until the Games. With the difference of the opinion that now exists in the ministries and in security agencies regarding the soft measures like commissions and adaptation of fighters, like more open religious voices, like Sufi Salafi dialogue, it is still very unclear which way the situation will develop. It is very unlikely that the soft measures will expand and get deeper in the next several years. Neither do we expect any